our initial scenarios and recommendations because we never tested them with Malone, and that's what we're doing. Is now we have an idea where we want to be. Now it's just a refinement in the process and in doing the doing the math, doing the hardcore, the lines and showing the distribution and the numbers where they would go. We have to do this effort regardless. If we were, even if you wanted to submit June 30, whether we make that date or not, that'll be determined. But this has to happen no matter what, whether it's now or later. So why not do it now? It only, at least for us, this is the next step in the evolution of the scenarios to drill down farther, sharpen our pencil, and have better data. Sylvia, I think.
Yeah, I would like to just add to what's been said already. Having sat at the council desk for a long time, I've seen the results of projects that have been rushed through without careful thought. I am absolutely convinced that we need to move forward with facts, not wishes. And I think this obviously, as Chuck Orrington it says, these are the facts we need to have on which to base our choices of scenarios. And to rush something through without being able to completely justify our requests to the state, to the council, to the taxpayers, to the education system, we need to be careful and think about it carefully. This project is building schools. Our schools have lasted for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. These new schools that we're going to build, or the ones that we're going to add on to, are going to be around for a long time. And we cannot afford to rush the process to get it done quickly without thinking about locations, with thinking about the site plans, thinking about the number of students. There's a lot of pieces here that we need to be careful about. So I too am very concerned that we cannot justify a decision until we have all those clear facts delineated. And I think to try and move it along any quicker, I know we're all anxious. I know we want it to get moving. I know it's hard to be patient, but in my advanced years, it has always served me well to take my time. And in the long run, by being careful, you get a much better long-term result. So I agree so far with the comments that have been made.
I don't think anybody is looking. I would think that we all want to get this done right, and we don't want to rush this. I certainly agree with those points. What do we think now is sort of a new time frame? I guess that's probably what we should be discussing at this point.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and Jim, I think so next week they're going to come back with their initial analysis, and it's going to be interesting to see what they come up with. And where I'm at least from our side, is let's wait. It's going to be another week. Let's see what they come up with, and if it is in fact, say, looking at the case section, say if it's 1,000 at least, or 975, whatever that number is. Now we have some hard data. We're not guessing at it. We know that's what it should be. Now that then we bring it back to this committee and collectively, is that too big? It sounds like that's the case, but from what we talked about last time, what would the largest number be that you'd want to build? Is it 700, 800, and that's where SLR in working with the Board of Ed, with Ben and Jeff, and they're going to talk about the programmatic requirements of a school that size, and what's the largest they'd want to go, how many sectors per grade, and we mentioned last time the how many cafeteria ways, what kind of staffing do you need, a principal and assistant principal, or just a sole principal? A lot of nuances associated with that type of school. And if you do decrease it, okay, where can those numbers go? And they're going to advise us, where they think they can put those numbers based upon, again, they're looking at the capacity, they're looking at the programming of those buildings, but we might have to look at, okay, is there maybe a better way to revise the programming in those buildings with what you have, because there's capacity. And as we stated many, many times, and we're going to say it again, the state's going to look at what's the projected enrollment for that school. And if you are, if you take that space standard, says you should be 90,000 square feet and you're projecting 100 and saying you want to build 110, they're going to push back on that. They're probably not going to support that. You're going to have to have really good justification for it. It's not that you have to meet it 100% because they understand there are programs, your special ed programs and others that require additional space, and they support that, but within limits. It's not going to be an endless, you can be at 85%, space standard ratio. We know they're going to push back. They want to see us 92, 93, and better. So, but once we get the initial data back next week, we'll come back. It might be another week or two, depending on what we see, to go, okay, let's look at a different scenario. Let's, tweak it, the option. And I don't think it's going to take another 2 weeks for them to do that. It might take another couple of days. I'd have to let them speak for themselves, because we don't do that, and then come back and go, this is what the numbers are looking like, and do they seem reasonable? So
Jim, I don't know if you're looking for like an overall timeline for the rest of this phase of the project, but I'm not really sure that we can, figure that out right now. It's going to depend on what those numbers are that come back from SLR, and then, being able to analyze that. If it turns out that there's a really easy solution and we have a scenario that works, then, it'll be faster. If it turns out that the numbers really don't work out right and we end up with a school that has 900 kids in it, then we have to kind of go back to the drawing board and figure it out. And I think it's really going to be very dependent upon what SLR comes back with.
Right. Okay.
yeah, Paul, I don't mean to be beating around the bush on it. I just trying to be realistic of that. We don't know what the data is going to say at this point. And
Yeah, no, I understand. That's fine.
yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Rich?
Richard, yeah.
Not a question. I'm just going to express my great deal of frustration as I'm sitting here. I think Don and some others have already expressed, the concern about the timeline. We've been talking, scenarios for months now. Had whittled it down to a couple. We're supposed to, be at a point where we were ready to make some final decisions and go talk to the town council. And here we are, the end of February, and I get the sense that everything's up in the air. I'm hearing of 1,000 student elementary schools for the first time, when it was supposed to be a 700 student school. Or, I'm just frustrated with the timeline and the process right now. And I agree, if this much is up in the air, I don't think we're even close to going and putting something before the town council.
Rich. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I would, thanks, Rich. Reiterate Rich's comments just to be on the record. It's extremely frustrating to look at the amount of hours that we've all taken away from our lives and families and time put into this. And we've looked at, since I've been in Cheshire, and I didn't grow up here, but over a decade, the schools have been a disaster and the teachers have complained and the kids are not getting what they deserve for this town. And we've not addressed it. We've not addressed it. We've not addressed it. And here we are again. We're going to have to delay because, of course, the points are correct earlier. We can't make a decision and be good stewards for the town without having all of the data. But it just seems like what we've done so far has really been a waste of time, because now we're starting over again and we have no idea what the numbers are. And our enrollment numbers have changed every week that I've been on here, and it's very frustrating. Thank you.
Thanks for your thoughts. Just to kind of talk about that a little bit. We did have scenarios, and I feel like all the work that we have done so far is very valuable. We are still going with the scenarios that we have vetted. It's just a matter of refining the actual enrollment and making sure that we can fit our peak enrollment over the next 8 to 10 years in the schools that we're building. So it has come to light recently that there's a possibility that with redistricting, we still may not be able to have the right size school that we want. We could certainly build a school that will fit all the kids, but I don't think that's really what the town wants. So I think that's where we kind of got hung up, where we're we could possibly build a school with 900 children, but is that the direction we really want to go? So I think all that work that we've done has been very, very valuable. It's just looking at it and saying, okay, where has it gotten us right now? And is this the direction we want to go? Matt, go ahead.
I'd just like to go, like you said, Jen, we vetted two scenarios, one of which had a new central office in it or in renting additional space for a central office. And all of a sudden last week, it comes to, we're going to keep Humiston and we're going to remodel it and we can get $100,000 grant or some crazy grant when it's going to cost us $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 million. We don't even know because the numbers were in 2017. They haven't been updated. So yeah, that's a frustration too. I want to know when this discussion happened that all of a sudden we're going to keep Humiston School. And we're not going to rent and we're not going to add on to one of the schools. This is frustrating to this committee. I think decisions and discussions are being done by very few people and not bringing the rest of us into the discussion. I really don't understand how last week we all of a sudden said we're going to renovate Humiston School. That's just wrong.
There were no discussions about Humiston outside of this meeting. It happened fully in the meeting that we had last week on the 10th.
Yeah, last week, but not the scenarios that we vetted. The scenarios that we vetted specifically said we're going to add a new central office to an elementary school, or we were going to look to rent space. And all of a sudden, last week, at last week's meeting, it was brought up to the fact that no, we're going to redo it, and now we have to redo all the numbers. We have to back the capital improvement numbers out of what we thought the town was going to save. This is completely frustrating, and I agree with everyone that said it's frustrating. There are decisions being made here by very few instead of all of us.
I don't understand what your point is because we discussed Humiston in our meeting last week and everyone was in agreement. I actually felt differently where I kind of still wanted.
Everybody was in agreement again. Not everybody. Yeah. We should have taken a vote. Don, not everyone was in agreement. Yeah.
Yep. So, I understand, Don, that you voiced your opposition. But it was not that everyone was in agreement, but everyone was in agreement that we discussed it and we did discuss it all together as a group. And we came to a conclusion that was what we wanted to do and nothing was decided outside of any meeting.
I honestly think those things should be voted on instead of just discussions. Those really should be those kind of decisions when you're changing a scenario should have been a vote instead of a discussion. Because I mean, I don't know if there are other people in this group who might have voted to keep it in. I don't know. I think we should have taken a vote on that, but that's my opinion. And I still think it should be kept in phase one because it's going to be a tough sell to everybody. If we keep it, if we take it out of phase one, no matter which scenario we choose, that should be.
Okay, so do we want to address it again? And take a formal vote?
I don't know that we can legitimately address much of anything until we have these numbers.
That's true.
We're adding on to elementary schools. I don't know. I mean, there's so much hanging out there now that didn't appear to be hanging out there 2 weeks ago. If we're going to be putting this whole thing off for months, then we can look more closely into Humiston and what needs to be done with it. If we're trying to make a decision and get to the town council in 2 weeks from now, you know, that was part of the discussion last week, is that it was too much unknown about Humiston to leave it in scenario one. It needed to be looked into more closely. But if we're not going to make the March date anyway, then we can look more closely as to what can be done with Humiston.
Anne, I saw your hand first. Go ahead. Is Anne frozen?
Like it.
Okay. I saw, oh, no, she's gone now. Okay, Chuck, go ahead. I saw your hand and I saw Jeff too. And then we'll get back to Anne when she returns.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Rich. I think it's I don't think we can really talk about the scenarios right now because we don't know what they look like without the refined enrollment numbers. It'd be kind of confusing and premature to just throw a conversation of them together now. I think we need to
Yep.
wait, get that information back, and then take that deeper look at them again.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, you had your hand up too?
Just a, yeah, question more than a comment, and I apologize if this has been addressed, but why are we now at this point re-looking at enrollment numbers when we, I believe, paid for a study to get accurate enrollment numbers that we were basing all of our work on? And
So the enrollment numbers themselves haven't changed. We got that enrollment data from MMI SLR back in the fall. We looked at those numbers back then and saw that our schools were going to be over capacity very soon. And we decided to come up with some scenarios to fix that issue. What Chuck Warrington was talking about earlier was that we had some scenarios that addressed the enrollment issues, but I don't think we looked very carefully at the actual numbers as far as how many children would end up being in every school. We had an overall number, and we kind of had a general idea that if we take out the sixth graders, it would create more space. If we had a bigger elementary school, it would create more space. But it wasn't until we calculated that peak enrollment based on the numbers that came from MMI. We calculated that peak enrollment amount over the next 8 to 10 years that we realized if we have, a pre-K through 6 scenario for elementary schools for scenario 1A, that's 2,700 kids. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not we could consolidate down to 3 elementary schools. And that's kind of where we started digging a little more into that and realizing that, no, we can't do, 3 schools for 2,700 kids. I know there's a lot of questions about, trying to consolidate to save money, but that creates really, really big schools. And that isn't really the direction I think that we should be going in. And I don't think that's what the town wants either. So we have to keep those multiple schools open so that we have reasonable number of kids in them. So now the question is, how do we fit those kids in those schools? And that's where we are now, because that's what what SLR is doing, is trying to figure out how many kids are going to be in Highland, how many will be in Doolittle, how many will be in Norton, and then whatever's left over, that's what we need to be able to accommodate in this new K through or pre-K through 6 school. We were looking more generally, and as we drill down further and further into the numbers and the actual specifics of where each child is going to end up going to school, that's where we kind of realized, well, these schools are going to have to be a little bit bigger than we anticipated. And with that comes some concern, because we don't really want schools that are too big. We want to make sure that they're right sized. So the 2711 number is if we were to have K through 6 or pre-K through 6, and that 2328 number is if we were just to have the pre-K through 5 in the elementary schools. Even with those numbers, I don't think we can consolidate down to 3 elementary schools. I think we have to keep them at 4. So that's kind of where we are now. That's, the numbers from SLR didn't change from the fall. It's just a matter of how we're plugging them into our scenarios and how finely we're looking at all this stuff.
But if I don't still understand, I'm sorry, I jumped in, but I did exactly what you're talking about. I took the 2711, I took the capacities that we had, which is 2518. I closed down Darcy, I closed down Chapman, and we end up with a shortage of 784 kids. I don't know where that jumped up to 900,000 all of a sudden.
So it's 2711, and as of right now, based on the space standards, I believe, Chuck, we were using, it's 541 students at Doolittle, 814 at Highland, 426 at Norton. So if you take those 3 numbers away from 2711, you're left with 930.
Is that the capacity numbers that we had from Malone and McBroom?
I'll take
Sure.
that, Jen. So
Thank you.
yes, yeah. So the capacity numbers, okay, so and I think we've explained this before, so we attempted, I'll go through it again if you I can skip over it, but when they calculate capacity, first of all, the state of Connecticut does not look at capacity. It's not a fact. They don't look at it in that respect. What Malone is doing, they're looking at it from an educational perspective and saying there's X amount of classrooms, and they're assuming X amount of kids per classroom on average for that capacity, what they can hold. Every district is completely different in what their target is for number of students per classroom. They'll look at your special ed resource rooms, and Rebecca went through all that. However, when we're looking at enrollment, they're not a 1-to-1 ratio. Capacity and enrollment, those don't equal each other. They're two totally, they're not exactly the same. The enrollment numbers we received for total students projected, that hasn't changed. What we're trying to figure out is how do you redistribute them in these scenarios? How many kids go to each school, and how much more square footage are we going to need either in a new elementary school or potentially additions? The state of Connecticut, this is where we look at the state of Connecticut's going to go. So many kids times so many square feet per student. This is what we're willing to reimburse. That doesn't say you can't build a little more above it. That's going to be in the ed spec. But that gives us, that tells us how many square feet that the state's going to be looking at and gives us a gauge. And capacity doesn't have a calculation to tell us how many square feet.
So
There-
Chuck, 2 months ago, when we were looking at the various scenarios,
Mhm.
and at that time you priced out different costs and what the cost of the town would be and all that.
Yes.
That was based on capacity then, correct? Because you said that we needed a school, 700 students or something like that. As I said, using capacity, I came out with 784. Now all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, I hate to put it that way because that sounds judgmental, but we've changed the way that we are judging the size of the schools in the last 2 meetings that we've had.
Yeah, so in our initial estimates of 700, that was an initial estimate to start the discussions of what will these scenarios look like. And we stay with 700. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we should have asked, okay, 700 in that new school, and then looking at what the estimated, if in the capacity that they estimate and how we back in the numbers on the space standard are slightly different. Because when I'm looking at, when we're saying 814, and Jen, I think you mentioned numbers, there's like 814, and
It's 541 for 541 for Doolittle, 814 for Highland, and 426 for Norton.
yeah. So how we came up with those numbers, we took that space standard calculation. I'll be happy to bring that spreadsheet up again. And we said, okay, you have 106,000 square feet at Highland. If we divide that value by, I think it's 124 kids, 125 square feet per student, that's where we come up with the 814. And again, does that say that's the exact number you can fit? No, but that's how the state of Connecticut, using their calculations, that's how we came up with those, and did the same thing for Doolittle and same thing for Norton. And then we took is 2711 or in that scenario, and subtracted what those backing in those would be. And that's where we came up with 930 on those. But the initial scenarios a couple months ago were to get these test fits going. And we never had Malone really doing this hard study on redistributing these scenarios. That's where we're at now, is to redistribute those and have the hard numbers of where did these 2,711 students go, or 2,328 and a pre-K to 5 number. How do those get distributed? And that's what they do.
So our cost estimates then, including the work that Jim Jascott did,
Yep.
was all based on size of schools and everything else under the old calculations. And we're going to need to redo all that, correct?
Yeah, and we've already updated those, Rich. We looked at those already, and already calculated in for the high low for the 2A. It went up about anywhere from, like, I think 12 to 20 million on the high and the low total, and that's on the entire program for that. And that's, again, if we said, okay, here's we add the square footage for what Highland should be for 900 kids. Now, whether or not we can do the addition or not, that has to be studied. But we looked, okay, if we added that square footage for all the students and accounted for them, that's what we did. But yeah, we would have to refine those, and we're gonna have to refine them either way. Even if we did it before, we'd still refine those based on what Malone McBrune is telling us. And then ultimately, the other refinement is your ed spec. Okay, because you could build slightly over the ed spec. If you do your program for, say, the new elementary school, the space standard will say X. Your program may say you need to be above that value by a bit. if that's what if the state agrees to it and that's what the Board of Ed passes in the town ultimately, we would build your budget based upon that ed spec, not necessarily the space standard, because otherwise you might under budget that specific project.
It sounds to me like we're a long way away from
There's
final.
there's multiple refinements in the process. It's not like we just can't do one shot and say it's going to be, let's say 700, and that's what we're going to submit to the state. It is a refinement. This is what this is a refinement of the study and drilling deeper into the details. I do understand your comment and your view on it, though.
Okay, so we lost Anne before. I just want to give her the opportunity to make her point if she wants to. Anne?
I feel like we're past the point where I was merely going to remark that in our last meeting, we did not make the decision to keep Humiston and renovate it and get grants. We merely made the decision not to include it in the in the building of a new school, whichever school it was, because that then limits our options to be able to do other things that we might decide to do with Humiston School.
Okay, thank you. I saw a hand a second ago. Kate, was that you? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of like Rich. I'm really stuck on these numbers because, you know, when Mylona McBroom did the report and we looked at the capacities and the target numbers, like that's what we built our scenarios on. So now I feel like the rug has been pulled out from under us because now all of a sudden we're talking about an extra 150 kids that we were never talking about before, that all of a sudden the scenario 1A is all of a sudden not going to work. So really we were only presented with one scenario that's going to work. Like I'm really, really frustrated by this process because I feel like every time we come to a meeting, we get new numbers, new amounts. Oh, it's about 90 million. No, it's about 100 million. Like, I just want to see like the numbers. I want to see it in writing. And I don't want to feel like it's constantly changing. Like, I don't feel like I feel like we're so much farther from being able to present than I was last week. Like I feel like I'm starting all over again. We're starting from scratch. Like none of that work that we did with my loan is now valid because all of those numbers are wrong. Everything we've been communicating to the community, all of those numbers are incorrect. So like we've been talking about, when are these schools going to be out of capacity? Like all of that's wrong now if we have to use the space standard. And I don't even know where to go from here. I'm just so completely frustrated.
Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
You know, I'd like to see the numbers too. And I don't want to see them the night of the meeting, Chuck. I want to see the numbers a week or more ahead of time so that we can look at them and we can analyze them ourselves. You're giving us numbers and in 15 minutes, we've got to make as a committee decisions that really took you days and weeks and months to prepare. And we're expected to digest them in a very few minutes. So I'd like to have, when you're ready for your presentation as to what exactly we're going to need in the size of a school, that we get them ahead of time and that we can analyze them ahead of time. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Getting back onto the agenda, Chuck, you were talking about, oh, I lost my agenda, hang on. The SLR analysis, and then the next thing on the items was to talk about the location. So is that something that you're prepared to go through tonight?
Yeah, well, we looked at, what we did is we looked at the list of town-owned parcels that was provided. I think Sean provided that to us. There are open space parcels throughout the town, and there's a map, and some of those parcels are have conservation fund restrictions to them, the way we understand it. So if they have conservation funding and restrictions, it was a yes. Our understanding is that that parcel is basically off limits. and we couldn't use that. And if that's incorrect, please correct us on that, but that's our understanding for that. So what we've looked at is at a high level, the parcels that don't have the restrictions on that list, again, town owned only, and looking at various different factors, looking at obviously the acreage, the size of the school, to make sure it can, see how big it is. We're looking for parcels probably in that 15 to 20 to 30, depends on the scenario, but it can't be a 10-acre parcel for, these schools. It's just probably going to be, on the smaller side. Obviously, we've talked about Chapman. That's an existing school parcel. These are the other ones. So we looked at these parcels. We looked on the GIS mapping. That's the information that was available to us to look for maps, wetlands, streams. Also looked at the current, the GIS has for FEMA maps and so forth, and information. Looked at topography as well. And again, we haven't done geotechnical borings on any of these, so we can't opine on what's below the ground. But just looking at topography, looking at geometries of the parcels, and try to get an assessment of, is a parcel a good candidate or not for those. And we have those prepared. I can walk through those if you like, and show you what we're seeing. And again, this is at a high level. We're not doing test fits. We're not putting schools on them. We haven't done borings. We haven't done phase 1 environmental site assessment. This is purely information that's available at hand for that. So
Yeah, if we could go through those, that would be good.
okay, and Matt, we can wrap all this up, like you said, a week in advance, and we're showing it to you now, but we can wrap this up to have it distributed, and you can take a look at it as well. We'll follow up with Arnett to send that out as well.
Okay.
Matt, I think, has a question.
Oh.
Yes, Chuck, you've basically said that you've looked at the same maps that we looked at months ago, and that, you did an overall view or overview of what you've seen. But, you said some of them had conservation easements, but do you know what the language was specifically to what went out to the voters to buy these parcels of land?
No, we weren't tasked with that.
Please let me finish. Please let me finish.
Okay.
So you're going to present some things to us that you don't even know if they're allowed or not allowed. What I'd like to have you do, rather than go through a bunch of stuff that and waste more of our time that we don't know is good or not good, is that you select the parcels that you think, send them to the town attorney, get an opinion letter so that we know that they can be used or they can't be used for a school site. Instead of just sitting here and going through sites that we looked at 5 months ago or 6 months ago or 3 months ago and wasting more of our time. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you want to proceed. Our understanding was we received a list from the town of town-owned parcels. The initial discussion, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is some have conservation restrictions that we understand that would limit, maybe prohibit. I didn't look up the language. I'd have to go to the town attorney. We weren't asked to do so, but we can, if that's what you want us to do, we can do that to see if those are off limits. We assumed that they were based upon the conversations previously, but maybe that was a incorrect assumption for the ones that were listed with yes, conservation funding. Because if there's funding there, we assume that you can't develop those and they're preserved.
I don't know if that's a question maybe for Sean or Arnett. Is that spreadsheet that has that column in there, if are those off limits? Are we allowed to look at those, or what's the plan for any of those properties?
If in the document that staff put together, if there is conservation funding, then there are restrictions on the property. So those properties would not be available for a municipal construction project. The properties that do not have conservation funding. Those were the ones that we assumed would be the ones that would be considered. Of those, there's not many that are large enough. But the staff can dig deeper. We can pull the explanatory text. We can pull the actual resolutions for the capital budget, and we can provide that information to Chuck.
Are there any on the list that do not have conservation restrictions and that are large enough we can discuss tonight?
Yes, Jim, we found some that are large enough. However, you know, again, we were looking at, again, we don't have surveys. We haven't, and I keep saying that, but without that information, the analysis and the evaluation is restricted to what we do have. And that's geometry, topography, you know, again, the conservation funding, acreage, that's available to us at this moment. And then what we were going to do is show you those, you know, go through the list of parcels. We did a snapshot of on the GIS mapping that we can bring up and show you, you know, show you the parcel, share our thoughts on it, and see if, you know, if the committee had any initial response. You know, some of them have really sharp topography, or quite a bit of what appears to be wetlands and streams and so forth going through that you may say that you know, we don't want to dive deeper onto that parcel, and maybe we put that one aside. But that's what we were prepared to do.
How many are we talking about? Like, is there 5, 15, 50? I mean,
Now, really, it's only about 6 or 7 that that don't have, you know, and there's multiple parcels, but some of them are put together. So we combine those, by the way. There's a lot of parcels, but there's really only about 5 or 6 parcels or contiguous that we would, you know, consider, you know, looking at, and some of them are more favorable than others.
so I think we need to start somewhere. If we can take a look at the ones that you have on that list that you think are possibilities, we can discuss them tonight and then decide what our next steps are. If we're going to have you research them further and do more analysis on them, or if there's something that jumps out at anybody that says, no, this isn't going to work, we could certainly discuss that too. Is anyone?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
If you don't mind. I kind of agree with Matt on this, that, you know, before we jump into any properties, we should get our town attorney to jump in on what the legalities are of this. And then I think that's the first step. And then the next step is, you know, over wetlands and everything else is we'd have to get all that approval first. But are we putting the cart before the horse here by us looking at this and taking the time to look at this? And then we're going to find out, you know, in 3 weeks or 4 weeks that, oh, gee, we can't use that one. You can't use this one. I'm just wondering, is it worth doing at this point, or should we wait until we know what we're going to do and make sure that, you know, maybe each of those properties that you have in mind we could legally use to build on?
I thought we already did that. I remember months and months ago, Sean Kimball going through this list, and the list that was supposed to be scrubbed already of possibilities. So the list that we have now should be one that we could use, short of wetlands and topography issues. But maybe it's deja vu for me, but I feel like we've had this exact conversation months ago when Sean Kimball went through this.
That's the list we're using, Jeff.
Yeah, I think we did.
Right.
Kate, go ahead.
So what, from my recollection, what Sean did was he gave us which ones had conservation funding, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when it went out for a referendum, it wasn't worded in a certain way, like this will be open space. So that would not have been represented on his list. And I'm kind of agreeing with Don and Matt. I'm kind of thinking like, I wouldn't mind you listing what those 6 properties were, but really spending time digging deep, looking at the maps. I think it's a little premature for that. But, you know, I think Arnett and Sean need to have kind of that list of properties and going to the town and all those other steps. But, you know, I just think we don't really need to spend a lot of time on that, because I agree that we're really just not there yet when it comes to the properties.
Okay. Chuck, you have something?
I
No,
mean,
okay.
we talked about properties last week, and that was the whole idea of this meeting, and now we say we're not going to talk about the property, so just
I've
confused
been-
what we have on the agenda.
I agree. I've been hearing nothing except we need to find a property for weeks now. And now that we have a list of property, no one wants to look at them. So I'm just concerned and confused as well. Go ahead, Matt.
Yes, no, we need to find a piece of property, but that property needs to be vetted. And you know, you've heard people here say tonight that they're frustrated with the process that's going on here because it's not being done. We're not getting the proper information at the proper time. No one has talked to planning. No one has talked to anyone in the fire department, the police department, wetlands, and no one has talked to the town attorney. And Jeff, this was discussed back then, and people did say that these parcels were there, but they didn't know what was on the official vote or referendum that went out to the people. And no one in the last 6 months has looked into that. And my frustration is we're going to sit here and discuss 6 pieces of property that we don't know we can use. And this needs to be done first, not sit here and discuss for another half hour 6 pieces of property and then find out that 6 pieces of property, because of the way a referendum was worded, can't work. If you can't see that, Jen, I feel sorry for you.
Okay. Go ahead, Kate.
I've been the one bringing up the properties, I feel like every other meeting. And the reason I don't want to spend a lot of time with it is because I feel like we have some information, but not all the information we need. You know, it's just another one of those frustrating things where we're going to go through all this, we're going to spend all this time, and then we may or may not be able to even use any of them. We might have to go out and look at private properties. And then are we going to do the same thing and get partial information? And all of this is really eating up this valuable time that we have, that we're trying to move forward. And I feel like without full information, we're just not able to move forward. So yes, I really, really, really want to talk about properties, and I really think we need one. And I don't see how we're going to present without a property, but I don't feel like Chuck had enough time to even gather the information that we need to have that discussion.
Well, that was going to be my point as well, is that it was, discussed last week that we would talk about this week. So he's had a week and he's come up with this list so far. But if there is more information that you want, or if everyone wants, before we discuss them, then perhaps that shouldn't have been on the agenda for today.
Can I add?
Sylvia, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just listening to this carefully. I am not quite clear. I thought I understood that the 6 properties that we've narrowed it down to do not include the ones that were identified as having some conservation issues and referendum language and all of that. We'd already sort of separated those out. But what concerns me is just what Matt said, things that are sort of not intangible, but outside of that box. There's no point looking at a project if we can't get water there, or if we can't have oil or gas or whatever those kinds of those infrastructures. There's no point in having a discussion about a piece of property if the traffic pattern and the police feel it's unsafe to get there. So we have those 6 properties identified, at least the ones that Chuck has in his list, but we don't have enough information beyond the fact that, and he said that 3 times, the topographical thing, we don't have anything else from planning, from wetlands, from anything. Now, maybe we can't do test boring quite yet, but there may be some things that would immediately disqualify those spots before we even had to have a test boring. And it may simply be a traffic pattern or safety issue, or it's near a gas line, or I don't know what they are, but we don't know that. And that's what my concern is. And I agree with Matt and Don and whoever. We spend hours at these meetings looking at things, but we just don't drill down to the actual facts. And that is frustration for me as well. So at this point, I don't think there's a need to discuss those 6 properties until we get some just basic stuff. is there water there? Do we have to drill a well? Is there is there sewer there? How does that impact the project? Those are things that can easily be discovered on those 6 properties, but we don't know any of that yet. So I think it needs further investigation before we can narrow down any property that we can use.
Thank you. Chuck, go ahead.
I don't see why there's a point of talking about a property if we don't have a project. We're not building a school right now. We're coming up with a plan for the schools as a whole. When the town gives us the go-ahead on phase 1, whatever that project is, then you dig into the site and what it's actually going to look like. I still don't see why you need a site to give them an overall plan of what we're trying to do. If you're carrying a line item for the cost of what it's going to be, that is what it is. Once they tell us that it's okay, there's going to be a building committee more than likely that would get into the site and go from there. You don't need the site until you get to the grant application, and we're not there. We're just trying to present an overall plan. That's all I got.
Thank you, Chuck. Matt, go ahead.
How can we present to the town council any sort of format without either a budget number in for the property and saying that we're going to go with a private property, or with vetting, and that's all we need to do is vetting, just vet these 6 parcels. But this is why the town council didn't pass this in 2019, because the committee that was formed then came back without a location.
It was 2017.
I'm sorry, no, 2017 was a report. I believe it was 2019. But Jen, you had a pack going at that time to get it passed. So
Yep.
You know what, maybe you know more than I do.
At that point, it's my understanding they were proposing to build a school though, and they had sites picked out and they wanted to build the school on there. That's not what we're proposing. We're proposing an overall plan to address the schools over X amount of time frame in this order, this phasing. This is what we'd like to do. They give the go-ahead, building committees formed. They decide to put that size school that we recommended on a site. They find the site done.
Well, I thought phase 1 was a new school. If you build a new school, you need a site, but
This isn't a phase 1 committee is what I'm saying. This is the school modernization committee for all of the phases. When you get into a phase 1 building committee, yeah, they'd come up with the actual site, the actual footprint, the actual school that you're going to build. Are we going to look at 6 sites for 3 different size schools? I don't understand.
well, that's the way it's supposed to be done. We're supposed to have something complete for the town council, and we don't. If you don't have a parcel, it's not complete. And if you don't know if it's going on a town-owned piece of property, or you don't know if it's going on a private piece of property, it's not complete. And the town council, I doubt, will accept it. You've got 3 town council members here. Maybe they could weigh in.
I'd love for him to weigh in because I believe Rob Orris weighed in when he was here 3-4 meetings ago. And he said, if you're carrying a line item for it, then yes. If it was a town-owned property, maybe you develop it a little bit more, but you're just carrying a price for it. They have to approve
That's true.
the actual process before you even get into phase 1 of the building.
Rob did say that if we don't have a piece of property, then we need to build in, say, $3 million or to purchase property. He did say that. So I think, like Chuck said, we don't have a school we're building yet. So it's like putting the cart before the horse. Let's figure out what we want to build and then figure out where we can build it. I mean, I think the town council would like to have some idea of where it's going to be built and making sure that it's possible to be built there. But I think, if we say, for instance, we have a proper piece of property that's going to cost us, guesstimated $3 million, you would put that in as a holding so that we know at least that's going to be part of it. And then the town council would probably vet that out over the time before we ever decide on whether it's going to go to referendum question. So, correct me if I'm wrong, Sylvia or Jim, but I think that's really what we're looking at.
I think you're right, because we would have to have a figure, but if we identified some potential properties, we can at least address the finances. If we own the property, there's going to be a certain amount of money that's going to be required to develop it as part of the project. But if we have to purchase one, that may be considerably more expensive. So if we can present a plan that has some potential places in town, and we can say, if we use these, then it will be approximately this number to develop the property as a placeholder. Or if we have to go to a purchase price of a property that's a, privately owned property, we buy something, then we need to plug in another guesstimated number as to what it would cost to acquire another piece of property. But to know which property is not so critical. But I guess that was to my point before. I think we have to know if there's any town properties that could even accept something, even, if we have nothing, then we should be putting in a bigger placeholder in our numbers because we have to buy something. But I agree, in concept, that's exactly how it will work, and the town will appoint a building commission and they will figure it out. But we need to have a line number in there that we can base our calculations on. So,
Yeah, I think
Okay,
that, I think the council will want to have an idea, or at least our thoughts on where the property might be.
Right.
I think that's what we've been working toward. That's, I agree, that's where we need to be.
okay, so I'm hearing a lot of different opinions and decisions and processes that everyone is talking about. There's 13 different people on this committee, and it seems to be that there's 13 different opinions on how this should be done. I'd like to kind of take a step back and look at this from a bigger picture perspective. The next immediate step that we're taking is that we need to have SLR finish their analysis on the enrollment. Once we get that information, we can then analyze it and determine what scenario that we've already fleshed out and talked about makes the most sense based on this new data. Once we have that, we can then talk about which scenario makes the most sense and how to refine that and figure out what location makes the most sense. If it's a new middle school, the location might be different than if it's a new elementary school. So I think we're all getting too far ahead of ourselves, and we need to take a step back and talk about the process in general. So right now, what I'm proposing is that we just wait for SLR to get back to us with their numbers. We review those numbers, we talk about the scenarios, we discuss locations, we can talk about the next steps on the locations and who we have to talk to first about those locations. But I think everyone is just all over the place right now, and we need to kind of rein this back in significantly. So I would like to propose that we just stop, and we can conclude this meeting shortly after we get through the rest of them. But for this particular agenda item, I think we just need to take a look at those numbers when we get them. Our next meeting is scheduled for March 1st at this point. Chuck Warrington, I'm guessing that SLR will have those numbers for us by then.
That's our understanding, Jen, yes.
Will we have them early enough for people to look at them before the meeting?
So they were saying, let me contact, if you wanted a week before, I think that would mean we'd have to have them by the 22nd. I'd have to confirm with them. It was right around the 22nd, 23rd, based upon the information they gave to us.
I don't think we need a full week. At least a couple of days would be great.
Yeah, I would, if the 20, I don't know if the 25th, the Thursday prior to that Monday is acceptable to the committee. And this would be really raw information, their study without any preview beforehand. If that's okay, we'll check with SLR and have them distribute.
And what exactly will they have for us? The redistricting based on scenarios 1A and 2A, right? How the redistricting would work out?
Yeah, Jen, I expect there to be, if you remember their proposals they submitted.
Their maps.
Yeah, the proposed redistricting lines for the elementary schools and the revised projections for the future scenarios of each of the schools and what those projections would be.
Okay, great. So by the 25th at the absolute latest, does that sound reasonable? Rich, I saw your hand up and I see you talking, but I can't hear you.
There we go. I would, having worked in schools before, aren't district lines the purview of the Board of Education? If we go out there with district lines that another group has created, we could really cause a stir out in the community.
It was my understanding they were working with the Board of Ed on that, no?
Yeah, Jen, that is certainly is what typically occurs. And, you know, for them to do that, I think we're going to need frankly, beyond the first, if you just want the raw data of what they're proposing, but with Board of Ed vetting and going back and forth, and, you know, you have your committee here, but you have the Board of Ed that, yes, like Rich is saying, has to have input on there. So there's, you know, is I guess the committee, you know, saying, okay, yeah,
Okay,
the Board of Ed's got to look at it and endorse it.
I
So
wouldn't want to
let's-
put maps out there until the board has looked at it and approved it.
Right. Well,
So-
can I just add to that? Because I'm sorry to interrupt, but because I had brought this up to Tony once before, and I think the Board of Ed also needs to weigh in on whether they're in approval of doing a 6 through 8 middle school. I've said this in the past, but I think, you know, we're talking about building a 6 through 8, but right now we have a 7th, 8th junior high, and I believe that the Board of Ed has to approve that in order for them to switch over to that. I mean, maybe Vin or Dr. Solon could weigh in on that, but I don't know if that's something that we could just do without having the Board of Ed approve that.
Tony has supported that decision, or not
Tony
decision,
has,
but that, yeah.
But the Board of Ed has never voted on it. And I think it's something that the Board of Ed, I mean, Andrew or Ian, who are on here, I mean, have you guys voted on that?
No.
Okay. So I think that's something that's kind of important. If we're looking to build a new middle school, we need to know whether the Board of Ed is going to approve of that before we jump ahead and say, we're going to do this. And then they say, well, we're not in approval. Now we're going to make a middle school and make it a junior high. I don't want to do that either.
Okay, so I can reach out to Tony and see what his feeling is on this, and if we need to have them take a vote before we even talk about scenarios. We have discussed a 6th through 8 middle school. We were in one of our meetings at Highland when all of the Board of Ed members came there. We did discuss it as well, and everyone was in support of it at that time. But I agree that it was not an official vote at that time. So
again, I don't believe everybody was in support of it, because I do remember hearing several of them say they weren't in support of it. That's why I'm asking.
Okay, Matt.
Don't forget the financials too. When all this is all said and done and we have all our proposals, we also have to have Jim redo all the financials.
Yep. Okay. So back to the question as far as timing. Chuck Warrington, if SLR is done with their analysis by, say, the 25th, do we want to give everyone a week, or give them another week of time to be able to meet up with the Board of Ed and vet it, or pass it off to them so the Board of Ed can vet it themselves? Do you think a week would be enough? I'm not sure who can speak to that, but
I have a
yeah,
question here.
sure.
And this might be an easy one to answer, but I thought we were waiting on changed enrollment numbers more than redistricting, because if we're going to have different enrollment numbers, is our redistricting going to change again once we?
It's not changed in, and Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not changed enrollment numbers. That's not the issue. The issue is how many kids can we fit in each school, and how that redistricting map is going to look to be able to fit those kids into that school. The number of 2711 and the 2328, those numbers aren't changing. It's how we fit those kids into all the different schools.
Are they using 3 or 4 schools?
Right.
4.
Or
Okay.
There's no way we can do it in 3.
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks.
Kate.
Can I ask, that 2328 number, where does that come from?
The peak enrollment numbers from Malona McBroom, taking just pre-K through 5th grade.
I can show that to you, Kate, if you like, graphically.
Well, I'm just questioning because I know our peak was 2711, right?
For
Or
pre-K
to
through
6.
6.
For pre-K to 6th, but
Yep.
there's only 280 kids in 6th grade. So where's the 383 kids?
Are you talking about 280 kids this year?
Yeah, and it peaks out at 295, like
So
40.
so they take the peak, the
105
highest
from
number.
pre-K.
There's 105 in pre-K, but they also take the highest number in any year. So it could be the highest number in 2025 for one school, and the highest, you know, it's the way they calculate it is different. So the peak number based on the next 10 years, including the pre-K, is 2328. And Chuck, if you want to bring up that spreadsheet, feel free.
Sure, and this is what we've been, looking at on ours, and this is taken right from their original enrollment numbers. Blow this up a little bit. So,
Mhm.
so this chart right here shows different combinations in the enrollments, the peak enrollments, and we went out to 29, 30 because by the time you submit a grant application, that'll be in effect, and these are the numbers we have. So you can see this is the K-5 enrollment. That total enrollment would be 2,223, and they're assuming 105 pre-K students, so we'd add 105 to the 2223 value, and the K6 is 2,606 in that same year, and adding on 105 students would equal 2,711.
So that means they're projecting we're gonna have 400 sixth graders? Am I doing math wrong?
I can do if you just bear with me, Kate, for that year.
383? Wow.
383 is, yep, 383 sixth graders for that academic year. That's what they're projecting. There. I just want to highlight each of the schools, the way they distribute them. So yeah, so what their task is now is basically redistributing those values, and they'll most likely change from what their prior enrollment or projections were for each school as is.
And these are, okay, so these are just the enrollments.
Yeah, these are the enrollments for the as is condition without any redistricting. This is by school based upon your current status.
Can you send that to us?
Certainly. We'll extract this sheet out, and we'll send you the Malona McBroom study as well, Kate, so you can, compare them.
Yeah, I have that original one. She had sent that one out. The other one I was looking for was, did we ever get a copy of the financials from Jim Jascott? I don't recall getting that in my email. Did I miss it?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I will have to go back and look.
I don't think we ever received it.
If we could, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I asked for that a long time ago and we did not receive it.
So Jim, would you be able to send that to Arnett and have her distribute it? Thank you.
And my apologies, I thought that went out. We will get that out to you all tomorrow.
Okay, so back to the timeline question again. If SLR is able to finish their work by the 25th, can we give them another week after that to touch base with the Board of Ed and review everything with them? And I know we don't have we have a couple people from the Board of Ed here, but I'm not sure if you guys can make that decision to be able to do that. I don't know if you have to have a meeting or if you can do it through email.
We have a meeting tomorrow night. We have a full business meeting tomorrow night, so I'm sure I could bring it up.
Okay. Will you be able, you can do that, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm going to do
Okay.
the school modernization update report to the board tomorrow night.
Perfect. Thank you.
So.
So that's probably a good point also to kind of check in with them, and I'll ask Tony as well through an email, but if you could ask them as well about their support of a 6th through 8 middle school, that would be helpful. Okay. So that means our next meeting of March 1st is right in the middle of that time frame of trying to be able to have SLR meet with or review with the Board of Ed. Do we want to have that meeting and just discuss where we are, or do we want to push that meeting out to be able to discuss things in a more concrete fashion? And if so, what's the next best date for everyone to be able to make?
Jen, I will tell you that usually planning and zoning is Monday, March 8th. And that night, they're not having a planning and zoning meeting. So if you wanted to move it out a week, I would be available to do the minutes. So just wanted to let you know. Okay,
How's everyone else's calendar look for Monday, March 8th?
Marilyn, I'm on planning and zoning and I have received nothing. You're sure of that?
yes, there's no meeting on March 8th. There's no applications.
Oh, okay, thank you. I knew we had gone through everything at the last meeting, but
Yes,
all right.
we did.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I see a thumbs up from Jeff. Thanks.
I think the 8th works fine.
Okay. If anyone can't make it, tell me now. Otherwise, we're going to go with March 8th. Okay, so our next meeting will be March 8th. And at that meeting, we will have the maps and data from SLR, and it will already be reviewed by the Board of Ed. And we will receive a copy of it at least a few days ahead of the meeting so people have a chance to review it. And I'll work on that timeline with Chuck to make sure that that gets out. At that meeting, the purpose of that meeting will be to go through all of that information and then use that information to further refine our scenarios, make sure these scenarios still make sense based on those numbers, and if they don't make sense, what we can do to fix them. If anyone has any suggestions as far as any other scenarios that you want to discuss that might help alleviate some of this enrollment data problems, feel free to let me know. We can certainly discuss other options at that next meeting. And if you have something that, jumps out at you, let me know. Anne, go ahead.
Do we need to formally go to the town council and
Yes,
ask for an extension?
yes, we do.
I mean, do you, Jen? Sorry.
The royal we, yes, the royal we do
The
need
royal
to.
we, exactly.
I'll work with Arnett on that.
You're going to need a motion for that, aren't you?
Arnett?
You can certainly vote on it if you want to formally take an action to request an extension from the town council.
Do we have to have an actual date in mind as to when we want to go to the town council? Or can we have it open-ended where we want to be able to postpone it and decide at a later date when we are ready to go to the town council?
Generally, because your committee has a deadline, we would pick a date. You can always pick a date that's further out, and have the language state or earlier if ready sooner, although sounding better than that.
Okay. Okay, so with that, would someone like to make a motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion that we ask the town council to extend our committee from March 1st to April 1st.
Second.
Quick.
Too fast? There's some discussion on the floor. Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be ready by April 1st. I think we got a ton of stuff in front of us. And I think, we need to push this out farther than that.
I agree with Rich. I think we have a lot of work to do.
I
If
agree.
Jeff will withdraw his second, I'll withdraw the motion.
Withdraw.
I withdraw my motion. I'd like to make a motion that we extend it to June 1st.
I'll
Would
second it.
anyone like, okay, any discussion on that one? Andrew, are you talking? No.
Counting months.
Oh. You're talking to yourself. Okay, anyone have any discussion on that? Are we comfortable with June 1st? With the knowledge that if it really is June 1st that we end up going to the town council with this, that there is no way we will make a June 30th grant deadline for the state. I just want to make sure that that's on record and everyone is understanding that that's the implication.
You have many things you have to do. You have to go to wetlands. You have to go to the police department. you
I'm
have to
sorry,
go to
I
the fire
don't,
department.
I don't think we need to
But
go
you-
through the
you-
list right now.
Yeah, well, you do need the list right now because, yeah, you're not going to be ready June 30th. In order for him to have an application, it has to go to planning and zoning. It has to be approved by them. So yes, you do need a list.
Any other discussion on the motion on the table? All in favor? Oh, sorry, hold on. Anne, go ahead.
So if we are not going to be applying for our application this year, we're pushing it out another whole year. Does that mean our costs are all going to change as we move forward?
So, and what would change as far as escalate the time factor is when you'd hold your referendum. So right now, my understanding is the goal would be for a November referendum. Okay, and that means once you pass funding, you can start the project. The grant application we mentioned before, if it pushed out a year, what that does is just delays when your reimbursement starts by a year. But if you push out the referendum, then yeah, depending on how far it gets pushed out, that could, that could affect your escalation on the costs.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. That helps.
But it's,
Oh, go ahead.
just to be clear, we're still shooting for a November 2021 referendum.
We haven't discussed anything other than that. Yeah, I would say that's,
just-
yeah, right.
The only difference is that you don't have that grant already approved or applied for at that point. The original plan was that we were going to the state first and then going to the referendum. With this new adjusted timeline, we would have the referendum and then have to go to the state at a later point.
So we would only risk potentially losing architectural fees.
For the most part, Andrew.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You
for the
you
most
wouldn't
part, there's a
lose them
couple-
though. You just wouldn't be reimbursed for them right away. Is that right?
Well, if for some reason
Good.
you passed it, okay, and we would have our meetings with the OSCGR, of course, and hopefully have a very good indication from them. They won't put it in writing. So if anybody asks, they won't give that to you in writing. But have a good idea of will they support that specific project. If they're not gonna, they'll tell you. The director will tell you we're not going to support it. But if they do, they'll say, yeah, this looks good. Go ahead and move forward with the plan, submit your grant application. So you have an indication. Is there guarantees? No, there's no guarantees. The legislator, it's all up to the legislation, but if he controls putting you on the priority list, if he says he supports it, he's true to his word. He'll put you on the priority list come November of 2022. And then December 15th, they publish the list. And essentially, once you're on that list, we haven't seen a project come off the list. Let's put it that way. And then it gets acted upon in 2023. Roughly summer, August is when you could submit your reimbursement for all those costs going. So you're carrying approximately a year to year and a half of expenses, which is primarily architect's fees, any pre-construction. If you hire a construction manager, those fees for design, basically.
One other question I had was about the contract that we have signed with Colliers and how that was broken down between phase one, pre-referendum, post-referendum, all that analysis and stuff. The fact that we did not meet our first date of last year, and now we're not meeting this date in March, how does that affect the contract with Colliers and SLR? And is there an increase in the cost for your services?
Are you asking me, Jen?
Yes.
Well, SLRs, I mean, theirs is really, theirs is a bit different than ours. They're task-based. I mean, as we discussed last week, they're looking at cost per scenario, and then we get the data next, look at it in a couple of weeks and decide, okay, do we want to refine it? We have to wait and see.
Okay.
And they'll advise us on that. With respect to ours, the remaining ones are there. We'd want to discuss it probably offline of where we're at, the hours we've expended, and have a discussion with you,
Okay.
whether, if there was any additional services warranted, but I'd have to put all our hours together and take a look at it and evaluate it to see if we'd even request that. But I appreciate
Okay.
the question.
Andrew.
I think it's important that we go on record saying, even if we push this out to June and we miss the submission date of June 30th, we're still not delaying the actual construction of what project we choose. Is that correct, Chuck?
That'd be correct. If you pass referendum, because we're assuming in all our preliminary, in those high level macro schedules, the assumption is a November 2nd or November referendum. That's when projects start in earnest, and that's when the state says anything prior to pre-referendum, it's not eligible. Once you pass the referendum, you can proceed, and those become eligible. But yeah, there's no pause after that unless we've had some districts say, well, we want to wait until we have the grant, when we're on the list and on the grant commitment, and that's a whole year. You're talking what, 3.5%, 4% escalation on whatever the cost of the project is. If you believe in the time value of money and escalation, then that's real. So
Could it potentially make our application that goes in June 30th in 22 look better to the state because the town's already approved it at referendum?
I don't know if this looks better. What's going to look, in my experience, Andrew, what's going to look better for them is that project being right size, meeting educational specifications, being close to the space standard. That's what looks attractive to them in demonstrating that we've done the homework. Because if you go to them, we haven't done the homework, then they're going to go back and say, go do more homework themselves. And that's what we don't want to do. They like seeing a well thought out plan, holistic plan, and whatever that project is, as long as it's meeting the educational needs of the Board of Ed, and the Board of Ed says, yes, this is the project we want and need, and the other factors we talked about, then they'll look favorably upon it.
Thank you.
And just so you know, the town council will decide on the referendum. And I think we have until, Sylvia, is it August that we decide on referendum? Or Arnett?
90 days.
It's
Arnett.
end of August.
End of August. So we have until then to decide on what goes to the referendum question. So we do have some time, but ultimately, it'll give the town council several months to go back and forth, maybe with this group, to decide, what we may or may not do. But I would like to get Jim Jascott to figure out what our carrying costs may be on that, because that's all going to have to be added back into the cost as well. Because if we don't go to the grant until next year, and it's going to be a year and a half before we get reimbursement, we need to know what the carrying costs on that money is as well.
Right.
So that will all have to be added back in there too.
And Jim already has been aware of that, and he indicated that it was a reasonable cost that the town could afford to fund, but we haven't had a specific number yet until we have a project. So
Yeah, we don't know the number until we know what we're doing. So
we
yeah,
know the project,
Right.
right? So, but he felt that the scenarios that being presented were within the tolerance level of being able to fund those initial costs.
Okay, so we still have a motion on the table. Is there any other discussion? And does anyone have any other questions about the impact of delaying this until June 1st?
My only comment is I think it's very smart to do that. If we get it done earlier, fine. But I think, just as everybody has said, it's important to have, and Chuck just said it, the state wants a project that is fully vetted and fully fleshed out. The council wants that. The Board of Ed needs that. I think it's important that we push it out.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, I'll take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
1, 2, 3. I think that was everyone, right? Anyone against? Okay, motion passes. Okay, so next steps, we will wait for SLR to complete their analysis, meet with the Board of Ed, and we will have something to review on March 8th when we meet again on the 8th of March.
Perfect.
Next item is communications. Rich, you had said that there's nothing new to report. The survey is still ongoing. Any other update?
Well, the only thing, I did get some updated numbers on the survey today. They're up to 848 online responses. 88 of those are business owners. I asked how far they had gotten on the 400 calls, but they were checking on that and didn't get back to me before the meeting today. So we'll see. We have one more week on it, so we're hoping to hit 1,000, which I think is a good shot. We'll now have some time to analyze the numbers before we have to make some final decisions on scenarios.
Okay. Any questions on communications?
I can report that my wife was called today for the phone survey, so we know they're calling somebody.
Nice.
Good.
Okay, next item is public comment. Arnett, do we have anything?
You do not have any public comments.
Okay. We've already talked about the next meeting and the topics. And we had an item on the agenda to discuss anything in executive session that we needed to regarding the locations, but obviously that's not going to be needed. So I would like to call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Jim. Second.
Second it.
Sylvia, thank you very much. All in favor? Good night, everybody. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
Good night.